And we've obviously had horrible news in the last 24 hours. A member of the finance family has passed. You just couldn't find a more decent and caring person on earth than Mike Enzi. And he had policy ideas. He always talked about the 80% rule, getting everybody together. Early this morning, I was looking at a text he sent me earlier this year, inviting the Wyden family to Wyoming and naming all the great places that we would go. And this is going to be a very, very hard day. And I'm going to let colleagues speak, and I know my senator from Idaho would like to speak. He and I were both so fond of Mike. And then recognize colleagues and go to our hearings. And when colleagues have had a chance to talk about Mike and what stories, I was just reminded the Enzis always brought Christmas cookies for the staff. We all enjoyed that and just so appreciated them. So at the end of colleagues' remarks, we'll have a moment of silence. Senator Crapo.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also do want to say a few words about the passing of our good friend, Mike Enzi. He was a longtime valued member of this committee, as you know, and all of us have our own personal stories with regard to him. I know we've all been praying for him in the last couple of days since his accident. You know, actually, just to show the character of Mike Enzi, I got an email from him a couple of weeks ago telling me that he was praying for us because of the very difficult issues that we are working on right now. And I mean, what a thoughtful thing for Mike from Wyoming to share those words. For over 2 decades, Senator Enzi passionately served the people of Wyoming as a thoughtful conservative leader. He brought his experience as an accountant and a small businessman to Washington to tirelessly fight for the federal government's broken budget process, and he never wavered in those efforts. We had a shared philosophy when it comes to compromise, which is to focus on the things on which you can agree and worry about the rest later. And I valued Mike's judgment and friendship. And I'll close with this. He said that he tried to live by his mother's advice. Do what is right, do your best, treat others as they want to be treated. And he certainly did that. We will miss him.
Thank you, friend. Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Walking in this morning, looked up, we have a large picture of the Finance Committee members from last session, and in the front row is Mike Enzi. Big smile. I worked with Mike for 20 years since coming to the Senate, both on the Finance Committee and also on the Budget Committee. I loved his sense of humor, and I loved his fairness. I'll never forget a couple of years ago when he was working to make major changes in the budget resolution process, and he called me, knowing actually he was going to be telling me some things that he knew I didn't agree with. But he called me anyway. He called me, it was in August, he called me, he walked through everything and listened to my concerns and was very respectful and said, I look forward to working with you when we get back into session in September. So he was a gentleman. He loved the Senate. He was somebody who cared deeply about being fair to everyone. And I am just so deeply saddened and sending a lot of prayers for his family.
Senator Cornyn.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, have many memories of serving with Mike Enzi, and it's not possible to think, I can't think of a nicer human being who I've served with in the Senate. When I first got here, he was worked on the Health Committee with Teddy Kennedy, and Mike was one of the most conservative members of the Senate, as you know, but he and Senator Kennedy were enormously productive on the Health Committee as chairman and ranking member. They switched that out from time to time. And I asked Mike about it, and he said, well, it's easy. It's the 80-20 rule. He said you agree on the 80% you can agree on, and you leave the 20% you can't for another day and another fight. It seems so obvious, but that was his attitude, and that was one reason why he was so productive. There's a lot of other things I could say, and I'm going to talk about Mike a little bit on the floor. But the other thing I remember about Mike is just his attitude was always so positive. And he was a little bit of an introvert, as we all know. And he blamed that on his being an accountant. He said an extroverted accountant, I think, is somebody who doesn't look you in the eye but stares at his shoes, or something along that line. I'll get that right. But he talked about having an attitude of gratitude and how important attitude is in framing the way we live our lives and we think about the world we live in. So we'll all say our prayers for Diana and the family, and as we remember a great human being and a great senator.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to make some comments about our colleague and his amiable attitude towards working together on legislation and his representation of Wyoming. I worked with him on several healthcare issues, several tax policy issues, several workforce issues. At one point in time, he said to me, you know, I actually wrote software code, and I thought, you know, you're the original high-tech guy here in the Senate. And it was that part of him that we all loved, because he looked at policy issues kind of straight up from how he looked at them. He didn't add an overlayer of politics on top of it. If he could be with you, he told you, and if he couldn't, he told you, and he told you why. But I loved the way Mike Enzi got around in his state. We talked about this, and he said, I just call somebody in a county, and I tell them I'm coming. And then they tell all the people to come over and bring the food. And we have a potluck, and we just sit here and talk about the issues. And I thought, what a great way to really communicate to your constituents. And I think that's what Mike boiled it down to, just the simplicity of the process. That I worry sometimes, I worry sometimes that the art of this is being lost, that just that basic communication with our friends and neighbors and people that we lose is getting all stripped away and sanitized down to an internet, you know, meme or something, when in reality, the face-to-face contact is really very important. And I will just add this last point. We had a major breakthrough on stellar legislation, which is all about how we reach our rural neighbors and communication, and the fact that Mike Enzi and several of his colleagues were adamant about not moving forward until we fixed it really gave us the impetus to fix that last year. So really, really thankful for him. My heart goes out to his family and to the people that worked with him so closely. This is not what we wanted for a colleague who went to retirement, enjoy a little downtime. This is not. But our prayers are with all of them, and thank you for giving us all this time to remember somebody who contributed so much in a very quiet way, but very, very big contributor to this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cassidy.
You know, Mike loved to serve. He loved to serve. And of course, we know how he served our country. But I once had a conversation with him. He'd gone to Africa, and he had seen how AIDS was devastating Africa. Not an issue you would expect a fellow from Wyoming to be interested in. But he saw the death. He recognized, frankly, this is an opportunity for the U.S. to do something really good, and that there would be the chance to extend U.S. influence, but his primary motivation was people dying of AIDS. Worked with George W. Bush for the PEPFAR program, and of course, in typical fashion, did it in a financially responsible way, saved millions of lives, has turned the corner for the continent of Africa. And it's one of the things that may not be mentioned in his obituary, one of the things that he was most proud of. And two more things that just come to mind of a fellow who was all about service. He was supposed to be help chair last year. He actually had the seniority over Lamar Alexander. But he thought Lamar was so capable, and he just thought Lamar should be chair, even though he, Mike Enzi, would have been by years. I keep on hoping that my two senior members feel that about me on finance. And then lastly, I said, Mike, why are you leaving, man? Because you still have a lot to offer. And he goes, I could do it next year. I'm not sure I can do it for 6. And it's important to have somebody here that can do it for 6. And so I just join you all in our prayers for Diana and our great memories of Mike.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. This is going to be a very hard day. Senator Hassan?
Yeah, it sure is, because my heart is heavy this morning, as all of ours are. I got to know Mike a little bit first in our kind of get-to-know-you conversation just after I got here. And I was just remarking to Catherine that our staff actually had to break us up after an hour. They were like, you don't have time to sit here and just keep talking. But we did. And we discovered a number of things in common. My grandfather was a shoe salesman, and Mike had owned a shoe store. And we talked about the shoe business. But we also had a couple other things in common, one of which was having children who had had very difficult starts in life. His daughter, my son, there was rarely a time when Mike didn't see me where he didn't ask after Ben, after the family, after how we were managing. Having shared the experience of welcoming a child into the world in really harrowing circumstances, Mike never forgot how fragile things can be, but how great the possibilities of inclusion are. And he was just always kind of giving me an atta-girl when things were going rough at home with Ben. And a couple other things. One is that Mike also was the prayer breakfast pinch hitter. When somebody couldn't speak at prayer breakfast at the 11th hour, Mike had always told the organizers, you can call on me, because he always had something to share about attitude. More than anything, prayer and faith is about attitude, I think, from Mike Enzi's point of view. And he really spoke about that beautifully and movingly and gave us kind of how-tos on days when things might be rough. He was just on Zoom and prayer breakfast last week. And we were all just reveling in the fact that one of the gifts of Zoom was that we could still see our retired colleagues and they could join us. He was one of the kindest people I know. He and I were trying to get this bill through to change the composition of our coins so we could save about $10 million. So I'll just leave that out there. I think Mike would want us to keep pushing on that because it was a very practical, common sense thing that we could all agree on and get done. And my thoughts, too, go to Diana and the family. They were such a part of Mike's service, and he never failed to mention them either. So my thanks go to them, and my heart goes out to them.
I thank my colleague, Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Similarly, as you can see, there's a common theme here about who Mike really was, his values, his principles, his priorities for his family, his love of his family, but also his love of this process. I don't think any of us have a different story. I don't care how long you've worked with him or how new you were to the Senate. And to me, that says a lot about Mike, because when I first got here, he treated me with respect. And I think one of my second opportunities to really get to know them, we traveled back to my home state of Las Vegas, to Nellis Air Force Base. It was a Codell. John, you were with us. And I think I was the only Democrat on the Codell at the time. And I have to tell you, he was just so gracious. And as Western senators, really had the opportunity to sit and talk to one another, get to know one another, and just really understood his commitment amongst everything that you all have said. And then after we got back, was able to work with him on legislation and really figure out how we can move the ball forward on so many issues that were important for this country and the public. So I echo everything that everyone has said. My heart goes out to his family. He will be missed. As someone who lost my father early in retirement, I think we were all hoping he would enjoy his retirement with his family and get the time finally to do just that. So thinking of him, like Maggie, my heart is sad today. And won't forget my opportunity just to get to know him in the short time that I was able to work with him here in the Senate.
This is going to be a day of swapping Mike Enzi stories. And whether it's shoe stores or love of beef, the list is going to go on and on. I like to think that his graciousness and thoughtfulness is going to continue to be expressed in this room in the days ahead. Let's have a moment of silence, and then we'll go on to our hearing. A moment of silence for our special friend, Mike Enzi. Thank you all very much. And the business of this morning is US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And we welcome our guests. And wish that they were here on a day that wasn't so sad. When a child turns 1, you give them a birthday party. So when a trade agreement turns 1, it seemed appropriate to have an oversight hearing in the committee. So today we'll discuss the USMCA, which of course is the lingo for the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. The timeline is pretty clear. 3 years ago, the Trump administration agreed to a rewrite of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the feeling up here was that it was too weak on key issues to pass. So Democrats got down to work to improving it, and as a result of those efforts, the text of it was the strongest trade agreement ever for worker rights, for environmental protections, and particularly for trade law enforcement. Now, the Congress passed it, and it was up to the Trump administration to carry it out in early 2020. Now, you have to have strong trade enforcement because countries don't comply with trade agreements by osmosis. They've got to be held to their commitments. They've got to be held to their commitments. And what's critical and not much understood about all this is the time when you have the most leverage is before an agreement goes into effect. So that's why Senator Grassley and I, on a bipartisan basis, strongly urge the Trump administration not to rush the process. Unfortunately, the administration wouldn't listen. Middle of the year, and in effect, they decided that a cake was baked before it was ready to come out of the oven. Only a few months were given to carry out the agreement, not anywhere near enough time to protect workers and businesses by holding Canada and Mexico to their commitments. Now it is up to the Biden administration to clean up the messes that I'm going to outline now that the Trump administration left behind. For example, Canada has unfairly blocked American dairy products for decades. Under USMCA, Canada agreed to give our dairy products more access to the Canadian market. The Canadians then undermined that commitment with new regulatory barriers before USMCA went officially into effect last July. The Trump administration hardly lifted a finger to do anything about it. Now the Biden administration will have to work to make sure that our dairy farmers finally get the access that they were promised. Another example, Mexico made commitments to improve the rights and conditions for its workers. It's moving too slowly on the implementation of those key reforms to labor laws. To enforce some of those commitments, the Biden administration has had to act using what is called a rapid response mechanism. And Senator Brown deserves enormous credit for his leadership on this. I was pleased to partner with him. It's an important tool, our rapid response mechanism. But the previous administration should have done more to push Mexico to raise the bar for labor rights prior to last summer. That would have helped protect more American workers. With the Trump administration coming up short on trade enforcement, looking weak, it's no surprise that Canada and Mexico issued new laws and regulations that were inconsistent with the text of the USMCA, even walking back some of the core commitments. For instance, Mexico is refusing to approve innovative American ag products, including corn and soybeans, without any scientific justification. It's also threatening to ban agricultural products that have been previously approved. Ambassador Tai and the administration are working now hard to knock down those barriers as soon as possible. Finally, Canada is joining a list of countries that are unfairly targeting and discriminating against innovative American employers with digital service taxes. Make no mistake about it. These unfair digital daggers are just knifing American firms and the prospects for creating all the high-skill, high-wage jobs we want. It's a big setback to our trade relationship with Canada that goes against the spirit of USMCA and the global minimum tax agreement that's in the works. I hope, and I've pressed this case with the Canadians, that they change course on the issue. Otherwise, the United States will need to consider all options for our response. So we have a lot to talk about. I come from a state where 1 out of 4 jobs revolve around international trade. What Oregon has always been about is growing things, designing things, innovating breakthroughs, adding value to them, and then shipping them to Oregon lovers around the world. In Oregon, we talk about getting trade done right, protecting workers and companies, creating high-skill, high-wage jobs. We want to raise the bar on issues like labor and environmental protection. We want vigorous enforcement. It means not cutting corners the way the previous administration did on USMCA. Fortunately, the Biden administration has begun addressing all the outstanding issues so that USMCA lives up to its promise. Lots of challenges ahead. I want to thank our witness panel for joining the committee. Look forward to question and answers. In the Pacific Northwest, we always try to find common ground on trade policy. We will again. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you giving us an opportunity to remember Mike Enzi before beginning the hearing. But returning to work, as Mike would have wanted, I also appreciate our witnesses taking the time to discuss issues critically important to the work of this committee. I specifically welcome Alan Huttema, Chairman of the Northwest Dairy Association and Dairy Gold Board of Directors, who is joining us from Parma, Idaho. Thank you all for taking the time to discuss these issues that are critical to us. Today's hearing marks the 1-year anniversary of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, as we all describe it. Mexico and Canada are 2 of our most important trading partners, and we cannot take these relationships for granted. To take one example, the United States exported $1.4 billion and $731 million worth of dairy products to Mexico and Canada, respectively, in 2018. But just a generation ago, nearly all of the dairy products produced in the United States stayed in the United States. Today, the Idaho dairy industry, which represents 6% of the state's GDP, produces more than 15 times the production necessary for our state's needs. Opening markets has fed our neighbors and created jobs at home. However, our dairy industry faces a number of new barriers, including attempts by trading partners to prevent our farmers from using common cheese names by claiming that they are geographic indications. The potato industry has also faced its share of challenges, with the Mexican Supreme Court only recently ruling that potato growers can sell fresh potatoes into all of Mexico, consistent with its obligations under the USMCA. And I've recently met with the President of Mexico and the Ambassador from Mexico and the Minister in charge of the economy in Mexico, and they have all assured me that they are proceeding to implement that trade agreement and that Supreme Court ruling to get the potatoes, finally, after years, into Mexico. However, I won't consider the matter finished until Idaho's farmers are able to sell high-quality potatoes to every family in Mexico. Likewise, when the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was negotiated, we did not fully appreciate the potential of digital trade, which my colleague Senator Wyden has referenced, which now contributes over $2 trillion annually to our GDP. That's why I support a number of USMCA innovations to help us meet the challenges of the 21st century economy and drive economic prosperity in North America. These include Canada allocating new tariff rate quotas for dairy products, Mexico agreeing to protect 33 common cheese names, a cutting-edge digital trade chapter, and better protection for copyright. This committee had a role in developing them, and it's appropriate to examine whether these innovations are delivering. That cannot be said for the last-minute changes added through the USMCA protocol of amendment at the behest of the House Democrat Working Group. This committee had no opportunity to vet those changes, or even see the text of these changes before they were finalized. I'm concerned that some of our Democratic House colleagues now want to push their changes that allegedly strengthen labor and environmental standards, but almost certainly weaken our intellectual property rights into new agreements before we even have a complete understanding of their full implications. I won't accept that. That's why this hearing is so important. If we're going to unlock the promise of the USMCA and also understand its shortcomings, we need to press for effective implementation and enforcement. To date, the administration's efforts on that front are fairly disappointing, and I will highlight 3 examples. First, the USMCA contains commitments that should facilitate cooperation on agricultural biotechnology, including decisions regarding the approval of such technology be based on science. This technology not only increases farmers' yields, but allows them to grow crops more sustainably, including by using less pesticide and reducing tillage. Unfortunately, Mexico has refused to approve any biotechnology food or feed products since May of 2018. Despite the clear economic and environmental benefits, the administration has yet to take any enforcement action on this important issue. Second, Mexico is proceeding with new discriminatory actions, such as measures favoring its own state-owned electricity and petroleum companies. Mexico previously prioritized dispatch on its electrical grid on the basis of cost, which allowed private producers, including wind and solar energy providers, to compete. Instead, Mexico intends to give preference to its state-owned electricity company. The administration needs to be engaged now before barriers like this are fully in place. And finally, where the administration is taking enforcement actions, it fails to do so transparently or in appropriate consultation with Congress. I'm referring to the use of the USMCA Rapid Response Labor Mechanism. As I noted at our hearing on the President's trade agenda, I'm committed to ensuring that our workers can compete on a level playing field. That effort requires transparency. Otherwise, how would Congress, the affected parties, and civil society know if the mechanism is being used appropriately and effectively? According to the USTR, we must explain what potential actions Accordingly, USTR must explain what potential actions, in its view, may or may not constitute a denial of rights. The USTR has failed to do so with respect to its recent use of the mechanism with respect to Tridonics, Mexico's facility. This hearing is a good opportunity for the committee to examine whether USMCA's commitments are delivering on their promise. This discussion will also help in developing a future trade agenda, and I look forward to hearing what our knowledgeable witnesses have to say in this effort. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for organizing this hearing, and again, thank you to our witnesses for appearing today.
Thank you, Senator Crapo, and I think it's very, very important that we work to find common ground on this issue. It's so important to American workers and American businesses. Let me give a brief introduction of our guests. Dr. Ben Davis of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is the Director of International Affairs for the United Steelworkers. He also chairs the Independent Mexico Labor Expert Board, established by the Congress to monitor implementation of the labor provisions of USMCA. He has decades of experience in this field, and we appreciate him. Mr. Alan Hudema of Parma, Idaho, guest of Senator Crapo, is a dairy farmer and owner of Almar Dairy, a member of the Northwest Dairy Association since 2003. Mr. Hudema farmed in Whatcom County, Washington for several years before moving to his current dairy farm in Idaho with his wife and 4 children. He too has decades of experience in the field and has been on the Northwest Dairy Association Dairy Gold Board. Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath of Washington, D.C. is the president and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, which represents 1,000 life sciences companies and organizations that are involved in the research and development of healthcare, agricultural, industrial, and environmental biotechnology products. She's a medical doctor, and we have worked, members of this committee, both Democrats and Republicans, have worked closely with her organization for many years. Finally, online today will be Ms. Beth Lowell of Washington, D.C., serves as the Deputy Vice President for U.S. campaigns at Oceana. Ms. Lowell oversees Oceana's campaigns related to ocean conservation, illegal fishing, seafood fraud, and other issues. And she has 20 years plus of working on these issues and joined Oceana in 2005. So let us go now to hear from our witnesses. We'll make your prepared remarks a part of the record, and if you can take 5 minutes or so to summarize your views, that would be helpful. We'll begin with you, Mr. Davis.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on the implementation of the USMCA and specifically the labor provisions which are so important to workers in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. I'm Ben Davis, Director of International Affairs for the United Steelworkers and also chair of the Independent Mexico Labor Expert Board, an entity created by the USMCA implementing bill passed by this committee and signed into law. The USMCA passed Congress with a large bipartisan majority. The steelworkers, along with the AFL-CIO, supported the final agreement after Congress improved upon the text negotiated by the prior administration. Most critical to our support was the emphasis on labor rights improvements in Mexican law, backed up by the rapid response mechanism initially developed by you, Chairman Wyden, and Senator Brown. The focus of the labor law changes was to disrupt the protection union system in Mexico, under which most workers have no real voice in choosing their union representatives and often have no knowledge of the contract that determines their wages and working conditions. This system has maintained artificially low wages. For example, at the GM Silao plant, the starting wage is $1.35 per hour. Workers' rights to democratic unions and collective bargaining have been denied in Mexico for many years, and the jury is still out as to whether Mexico's new laws and the USMCA will make a difference. Let me briefly summarize the key conclusions and recommendations of the board's report of July 7th, which is in the record. While there's been some significant progress on USMCA implementation in some areas, the board raised concerns about transparency, the contract legitimation process, budget and staffing of Mexico's new labor institutions, and U.S. technical cooperation. On transparency, almost 27 months after Mexico's labor law reform was approved, most workers covered by a union contract still don't have a copy of that contract or their union statutes, including the workers at Tridenex and Matamoros, which is, as has been mentioned, the subject of a rapid response mechanism case under the USMCA. The 2019 labor law requires employers and unions to give workers copies of their contracts, but these provisions won't be fully implemented for several years. Online access, which is already available for contracts in some jurisdictions, should be accelerated and should not require workers to submit individual requests. On contract legitimation, the board raised significant concerns about the effectiveness of the contract legitimation process. As of today, Mexico reports that 1,378 legitimation votes have been held, covering 797,587 workers, which is about 18% of the estimated unionized workforce. Government officials have stated that they ultimately expect at least 80,000 contracts to be voted on. This would require about 120 legitimation votes per day, every day, from now until May 1st, 2023. That clearly exceeds the capacity of the government institutions and may require them to rely on private notaries hired by the incumbent unions, as we've seen in the GM Silao case initiated by USTR. Putting the incumbent union in charge of the vote creates an inherent conflict of interest and potentially disastrous consequences. On budget and staffing, the board raised concerns about staff shortages at the Labor Secretariat and the Federal Conciliation and Labor Registration Center, which have faced a huge challenge of implementing the reforms under pandemic conditions. For example, the Federal Center currently has only 29 staff responsible for monitoring legitimation votes. Clearly, there's not enough money to support timely and effective implementation of the reforms. The Inter-American Development Bank gave Mexico an $800 million unsecured loan to support the labor reform, but it appears that none of these funds have been used for this purpose. Finally, on U.S. technical assistance, the board raised significant concerns about the pace and focus of U.S. assistance to support Mexico's labor reforms. Of the $180 million appropriated by Congress, only $50 million has been allocated, and only $10 million of that directly supports efforts by Mexican workers to establish democratic unions. Strangely, this initial allocation of USMCA funds excluded the auto and auto parts sector from labor capacity building. The board referenced the recommendation of Ways and Means Democrats that ILAB should spend at least $30 million annually on USMCA appropriated funds on worker organizing and union capacity building, and I personally believe this funding will be essential to achieve our goals. Without a fundamental shift from protection unions like the ones at GM and Tridnex towards democratic labor organizations, no amount of government oversight will result in a trade union movement that can organize and bargain for higher wages for Mexican workers to address the structural inequality at USMCA that drives both migration and loss of good manufacturing jobs. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Huddema, welcome.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Wyden and Ranking Member Crapo. It is truly an honor for a farmer from Parma, Idaho to be here today, so thank you. I am Alan Huddema, and I'm here today to discuss the critical role trade plays in supporting U.S. dairy farmers. I started milking cows in Chilliwack, British Columbia in 1991. 12 years later, I moved to Everson, Washington, where I started a 500-cow dairy. In 2010, along with my wife, Mary Jo, and our two sons, Christopher and Jeremy, relocated to Parma, Idaho, where we currently operate a 800-cow dairy and farm 500 acres of corn and triticale for silage. I also serve as the chairman of the board of Dairy Gold and Northwest Dairymen's Association, and I'm also on the board of National Milk Producers Federation. American dairy industry is an economic force employing almost 1 million Americans. The industry contributes $64 billion in tax revenue and almost 10 times that amount to the U.S. economy. Trade opportunities are an integral part of that story. Despite last year's difficulties, U.S. dairy upheld its reputation as suppliers of a variety of high-quality dairy products to the world. Around 1 in every 6 gallons of milk produced here was exported to foreign markets to meet global demand. When on a level playing field, American dairy products are highly sought after in international markets. Unfortunately, without sufficient market access opportunities to provide us with tariff parity or better in key markets, when compared to our trade competitors, American dairy farmers are left feeling the effects. Today, I will discuss 3 primary trade topics of great importance to the American dairy industry. First, the importance of USMCA as a catalyst to pursuing new market opening trade agreements. Second, the subsequent enforcement of existing agreements. And last, but certainly not least, the chronic misuse of non-trade tariff barriers, specifically the European Union's continued desire to lay claim to geographical indications. It has been a very long time since Congress passed a new free trade agreement, aside from USMCA, for which we are very grateful. Our industry needs new trade agreements with key export markets to counter our competitors, namely the EU and New Zealand. As our competition continues to ink new trade deals, the U.S. is increasingly left in the dust. We are the only country in the G7 or G10 that has such an incredibly difficult time understanding that trade is a good thing. We just need to work in a bipartisan manner and drop the extreme positions that have not been conducive to new market opportunities. We must focus on concluding comprehensive agreements with the United Kingdom, Vietnam, and Japan, as well as seeking new opportunities in China and Southeast Asia. On USMCA, we look at the agreement as an important accomplishment. As we like to say on the farm, a deal is a deal, which is why our industry appreciates the decision by the USTR Trade Representative Catherine Tai to initiate a dispute settlement proceeding with Canada over its government's administration of the dairy tariff rate quota system. We are grateful for this committee's support and advocacy in securing that step. I am Canadian-born, and I have worked in that system, so I know that their government will do all they can to avoid fulfilling their dairy commitments. The U.S. shall not tolerate trading partners not living up to their obligations, so we also must encourage this committee and Ambassador Tai to keep a careful eye on milk protein isolate and skim milk powder blend exports out of Canada. We are concerned that they may be increasing production to circumvent milk protein export caps, undermining the spirit of USMCA. Our other USMCA partner, Mexico, warrants greater integration and collaboration. A surge of newly devised customs and regulatory requirements have been in the works or instituted, including new documentation requirements for milk powder for U.S. exports that differ from requirements for domestic Mexican companies. In addition, several unwarranted regulatory barriers appear to have a more political connotation than a scientific background. Let me now turn to a topic that would be amusing if it weren't so serious: the EU's nonstop campaign on attacking names like Parmesan, Feta, and Asiago through GI provisions. I urge Congress to remind the Biden administration of the letter signed by 61 senators supporting the protection of common food names as a formal trade policy objective of all future trade agreements. Again, Chairman Wyden and Ranking Member Crapo, thank you so very much for the opportunity to testify to this committee on the importance of global trade to all American dairy farm families, including my own.
Thank you, Mr. Hudeman. We're glad you're here. Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, members of the committee. My name is Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath, and I am the President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. I'm honored to testify before you regarding the one-year anniversary of USMCA's entry into force and how the agreement has impacted the biotech sector, particularly as it relates to agriculture biotechnology. BIO represents over 1,000 members, and our central mission is to advance public policy that supports the application of biology and technology in energy, agriculture, manufacturing, and health. Our members work every day to cure patients, protect our climate, and nourish humanity. As the U.S. biotechnology industry demonstrated with our response to COVID-19, our nation can lead the world in developing technologies that will solve critical health and economic challenges. American innovation in biosciences, coupled with government leadership, can address growing crises such as climate change and malnutrition. Executing thoughtful and creative trade strategies is among the most effective means to strengthen the U.S. bioeconomy and enhance global science-based collaboration to effectively confront these and other public health, environmental, and nutritional issues. The enhanced provisions for agricultural biotechnology in USMCA represented a significant improvement on NAFTA for the industry. As a result, BIO applauded the inclusion of these provisions. Unfortunately, what exists on paper is a far cry from reality. The government of Mexico's treatment of agricultural biotechnology clearly demonstrates how trade barriers still actively restrict the development of new biotechnologies. Mexico's regulatory authority, COFEPRIS, has not granted a single new agricultural product application in more than 3 years, and its backlog of pending approvals has grown to 23. This bottleneck affects all of BIO's agricultural members, covering a wide range of commodities: apple, canola, corn, cotton, potatoes, and soybeans. Compounding matters, on December 31st of last year, Mexico issued a decree announcing its intention to phase out the use of important agricultural technologies, including biotech corn, from human consumption by 2024. There are numerous consequences to Mexico's actions. For one, they are impeding global research and development and jeopardizing the potential for biotechnology to address the many challenges that I previously mentioned. Take climate change and nutrition. According to the International Service for the Acquisition of Agrobiotech Applications, biotech crops reduced carbon dioxide emissions by 27.1 billion kilograms in 2016. These crops also help to maintain yields in the face of drought, which has direct bearing on food security and poverty alleviation. Unfortunately, provisions in the USMCA intended to invigorate investment and development of these technologies is now threatened by the obstruction of one of the agreement's key signatories. BIO appreciates the U.S. government for being a consistent champion for biotechnology, defending it against scientifically unjustified regulatory practices. However, with little indication from Mexico that it will adhere to USMCA's commitments, BIO strongly urges the administration to begin taking enforcement action against Mexico's unjust treatment of agricultural biotechnology. Without enforcement, BIO and its members fear the government of Mexico will continue the status quo and possibly even broaden the scope of its infringement to additional agricultural products. In closing, United States global leadership in biotech innovation is vital to the nation's security, climate policy, pandemic preparedness, and international diplomacy. Yet, our biotech sector is faced with tremendous uncertainty. Companies are making decisions today about whether to proceed with launch plans or delay, potentially costing them billions of dollars in revenue and future investment. Similarly, U.S. farmers are facing increasing challenges related to climate change and sustainability. Doing so without cutting-edge biotechnology tools at their disposal is like fighting with one hand behind their back. I've submitted a more in-depth statement for the record on the need for industry and government to work together to leverage American strengths and remove barriers that restrict the development of the global biotech ecosystem. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. McMurray Heath. So let's go now online to Ms. Beth Lowell.
Good morning, and first of all, my condolences to the loss of your colleague and friend. My name is Beth Lowell, Deputy Vice President for U.S. Campaigns at Oceana, an international conservation organization dedicated to protecting the world's oceans. After 1 year in force, Oceana has identified some ways to improve the implementation of the USMCA, and we have some outstanding questions. While the environmental chapter covers a wide range of issues, my testimony is focused just on fisheries. So seafood is a highly traded commodity with domestic and international fisheries management, high prevalence of illegal, unreported, and unregulated or IUU fishing, opaque supply chains, and links to forced labor and other human rights abuses. IUU fishing undermines the legal seafood trade, destabilizes coastal states with limited resources to enforce and protect their waters, and impacts national security. The International Trade Commission estimated the U.S. imported $2.4 billion worth of IUU seafood products in 2019 alone, and 25% of the imports from Mexico were products of IUU fishing. IUU fishing paired with fishery subsidies puts U.S. fishermen at a disadvantage, forcing them to compete with highly subsidized fleets and those that fish outside the boundaries of the law. The world's top industrial fishing nations are providing subsidies that make distant water fishing more profitable, drive overcapacity, and shift the risk of overfishing to the waters of other countries. Some distant water fleets subsidize as much as 20 to 40% the value of their catch. We were happy to see subsidies included in the agreement, and the USMCA requires the parties to notify each other of their fisheries subsidies within a year. This information is now overdue. The IUU fishing provisions include requirements to implement stronger measures, including port state controls, improved monitoring, control, and surveillance to deter IUU fishing. The USMCA also helps promote transparency through better documentation of vessels, and it requires each country to develop a publicly available and easily accessible registry of flagged vessels. Earlier this month, Oceana and Mexico released a report reviewing compliance with the USMCA. Our team in Mexico recommends that the government require more documentation, transparency, and traceability for seafood to comply with the terms of the USMCA, but also to comply with requirements under NOAA's Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP, and other trade requirements on fisheries like the use of turtle excluder devices in shrimp fishing nets. Multiple federal agencies under various authorities address international fisheries, trade, IUU fishing, and forced labor. It is critical that these programs are coordinated, including sharing information and capacity. The USMCA is one of these tools. Oceana wants to thank the committee for the inclusion of language to address forced labor in seafood in the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. This directed Customs and Border Protection to work with NOAA's SIMP program to inform implementation of the Tariff Act. This is the type of one government coordinated approach that is needed and can be achieved through leadership in Congress and direction, in leadership in the administration and direction from Congress. So after 1 year, Oceana still has outstanding questions on how the US, Mexico, and Canada are implementing the USMCA, specifically on fisheries subsidies. It appears that the US and Canada have reported some of their subsidies information under the requirements of the WTO's Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, but the USMCA requires additional reporting that it doesn't look like any of the countries have complied with yet. Second, the IUU provisions call for more transparency of fishing. So when and how is NOAA going to improve the transparency of our vessel documentation, including providing that publicly available and easily accessible registry of vessels? Third, NOAA was provided additional resources in the implementation legislation for USMCA for addressing IUU, including SIMP implementation. Specifically, they received $8 million. NOAA needs to report how that money is being spent, and if it is not spent yet, what is the spending plan? In a recent report by NOAA about SIMP implementation, the agency discussed how the lack of resources is hamstringing the implementation of the SIMP program. So this $8 million should allow NOAA to prioritize expanding the program to all seafood, ensuring that information collected can help identify shipments of the high risk of IUU fishing, seafood fraud, forced labor, and other human rights abuses. And lastly, how does the U.S. plan to work with the other parties when it identifies areas of noncompliance with the measures of the USMCA? Illegally caught or produced products give bad actors an advantage over those that follow the law. Trade agreements like the USMCA and trade programs like SIMP help set the minimum standards that seafood must meet to enter the legal seafood market. The White House, federal agencies, and Congress should work together to ensure that all seafood is safe, legally caught, responsibly sourced, and honestly labeled. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lowell. So let's begin with you, Mr. Davis. From day one, it was important that USMCA was a game changer in terms of trade law enforcement. American workers and American companies win when they aren't being undercut by trade cheats. So to cut off the opportunities for the trade ripoff artists, Senator Brown and I came together to create what has been called the Brown-Wyden Rapid Response Mechanism, a faster, tougher labor enforcement tool that is directly responsive to American workers and American businesses and Mexican workers and Mexican businesses. So the Rapid Response Mechanism, Mr. Davis, is pretty new. So far, the reviews are good. And my question to you to begin our discussion, and I think you're going to have a number of colleagues ask about this, are there additional steps so as to be able to make the rapid response mechanism even stronger, particularly to help address facility-specific labor violations?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Wyden. Rapid response is something that we fought very hard for in the labor movement. It's a very important mechanism. And we're very pleased that USTR is putting this into effect in a pretty emphatic way initially. We think it, and in the report, the board pointed to some of the difficulties that have occurred in the implementation in the specific cases by Mexico of its labor law reforms, and that is certainly complicated a little bit. And I'm thinking particularly of the Salau case, which is a complicated case. So we need to have the mechanism. We need to be using the mechanism regularly and effectively. But we also need to look beyond this to other aspects of USMCA and other aspects of the Mexican labor law reform, which they're committed to implementing. So, for example, in the General Motors case, we have a contract legitimation vote, which is the focal point of the alleged denial of rights. And that vote initially took place on April 20th. There was documented fraud and ballot tampering by the incumbent union, which was, as I pointed out in the previously, in charge, actually under the procedure, is actually in charge of conducting the vote. The authorities intervened, but they did not, they stopped the vote, but then they allowed the incumbent union to rerun the vote, still in control of the process. And the incumbent union from the CTM said, no, we're not going to do that. So now USTR has taken action, and there is an agreement that that vote will finally take place on August 20th, but that's 4 months after the original vote took place. And our experience from anti-union campaigns in the U.S. is that you may start out with a good, strong group of workers who want a union, but after they've been pressured and intimidated and all the things that happen in these circumstances, for 4 months, there's often not a whole lot left. So we're very pleased with the fact that USTR is going forward with this, but there's definitely concerns about how the Mexican Institute, the capacity of the Mexican Institute.
We will want to follow up with you, Mr. Davis, on that, because you have years of expertise, because we need to know about the next steps, and I appreciate that. Just because time is short, question for you, Dr. McMurray Heath. We looked to USMCA, updated obligations, new enforceable chapters on labor, environment, digital trade, and it took a long time to negotiate, but the administration seems so eager with respect to actually going during this election season. They were so eager to close on the House, they didn't wait for the inspections to be done. So here we are, we're still talking about some basic implementation on a host of issues that relate to your members, for example, that relate to the digital sector, hugely important areas. Could you tell us what kind of compliance and implementation actions, in your view, should have been taken before the agreement went into effect to make sure that our innovators, our workers, and our businesses could get the bargain that was written in the text? Your thoughts?
Well, thank you, Chairman Wyden, for the question, and you're absolutely right. Our innovators deserve and need our protection under these trade agreements. It would have been prudent, given the fact that we knew that COFEPRIS, the Mexico regulator, had ceased new approvals back in the May of 2018, to insist upon their resumption before the trade agreement went into effect. Given that that was not the case, it now really behooves us to make sure that we double back and hold them to their agreement. And we feel that this can best be done by the appointment of an agricultural negotiator through USTR. This is critically important to do because it affects not just our relationship with Mexico, but it has the potential to creep or seep into our other trade agreements with trading partners. So it's very important that we address it at this stage.
Thank you. We'll work closely with you. My time has expired. What's so important about this area is, having worked with you all for years, you are on the cutting edge with your members in so many fields of innovation. And when there is a delay on particularly updating the kinds of rules that are a way to greenlight opportunities for them, our workers and our companies suffer. So I appreciate your answer. Senator Craper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Huddema, as you well know, we've had issues with Canada over dairy for years and years and years. And finally, when the when NAFTA was renegotiated, we thought we had achieved some resolution of those dairy issues in the USMCA. Your testimony is, as I understand it, that Canada may be attempting to or is attempting to circumvent the agreement, particularly as it relates to how Canada has handled the application of its tariff rate quota commitments. Could you elaborate on that in a little more detail?
Yes, absolutely. When it comes to TRQs and access into Canada, the way they administer the TRQs or the access to Canada is through either processors, mostly through processors who really don't have any intent on importing product. Not only that, it really leaves a lot of the low-value product coming into Canada where it was our intention to get branded product into Canada, especially for Dairygold, close proximity to the Canadian border. We thought we could get higher value products into Canada. Another bigger part, just as big a part though, is they're continuing to export milk proteins all over the world. We see them in markets. It is as big an issue from the exports we see leaving Canada as it is access to their market when it comes to the TRQs.
And I assume that if we can get those issues resolved, that the actual terms of the USMCA with regard to dairy, for example, would result in significant benefits to American dairy producers. Is that correct? And could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So not only getting products into Canada would create more demand for our products, which in turn raise prices. The spirit of the agreement was great. We got access, we got what we wanted. Canada got to keep some of the markets they stole. In return, they gave us access to their country, which was all good. But the spirit of the agreement is not being upheld. It is definitely very advantageous for American dairy farmers to access markets. And when we're held out, it hurts dairy farm families.
Well, thank you. And Dr. McMurray-Heath, as you've testified, and as I indicated in my opening statement, Mexico hasn't approved an application for biotech crops since 2018. The economic environment for U.S. businesses seeking access to the Mexican market deteriorated significantly, in my opinion, in the last year. And their law requires that they approve these applications within 6 months, correct?
Correct.
So the question I have for you is there a scientific basis behind Mexico's treatment of our biotech crops?
As a former regulator, I can assure you, Ranking Member Crapo, that there is not. And this is particularly disturbing to not only our innovative agricultural businesses, but also to the investors that really support their work and make sure that the innovation continues. The behavior of COPREPRIS is very unusual on the global stage. Not only have they not approved an agricultural technology in that time frame, but they have not approved a biopharmaceutical product in that time frame as well. And that backlog is numbering up around 100. So this is incredibly disturbing. It disrupts the global marketplace. And because Mexico is such an important trade partner for us in our agricultural products, it hampers our innovators from developing new technologies, not just for use in Mexico, but for use at home and for use around the world. And their potential impact to help stem the tide of climate change is being impacted by this slowdown. So we greatly appreciate the committee's attention to this.
Well, thank you. And have we received any indication from Mexico's regulator as to why they have not made these approvals?
No, we know that this behavior started with the new presidential administration in Mexico, but our companies have received mysterious silence from the Mexican regulator since this backlog began.
And then one final question. I'm running out of time here, but I'd just like you to state on the record, my understanding is these technologies that we are talking about are good both for the farmers and for the environment. This is not something where there's some kind of a negative environmental impact that Mexico's trying to protect against. What we're asking is that they approve these applications for products that would actually help us boost the economy and strengthen the environment. Am I right?
Absolutely. These crops bring undeniable benefits to nutrition and to climate change, and they're accepted here and around the world.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, in listening to our leaders' questions, I think you're going to hear a pattern today of things that we are very concerned about and issues that we share. I appreciate all of you being here today. Mr. Davis, rather than a question, I just want to say amen to what you said, and I want to thank Chairman Wyden and Senator Brown for leading our efforts to get us to a spot where we can have a level playing field for workers. We certainly need that in Michigan. We need that across the country. I was listening very closely to your concerns about the effectiveness and the funding needs of the contract legitimation process. And so we need to be working together, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with you to make sure things are being done in the way that we anticipated when this passed. And Mr. Hadema, I come also from a dairy state in Michigan. This is our top #1 commodity in Michigan, and very much appreciate your comments about upholding both Canada and Mexico's dairy commitments. We fought very hard for that. That was a top priority for me as a leader on the Agriculture Committee. And so glad that we're seeing a dispute settlement panel that was put together in May, and we know how important the dairy tariff rate quotas are, but I wondered if more broadly, in addition to our focus there, which is critical, in terms of export markets, when you look at the USMCA, what are some of the most important pieces to replicate when we look at future trade agreements?
Yes, great question. So when you look at it, #1 is market access, especially when it comes to Mexico. The zero tariff on our imported products there was a great thing to go after. #2 is that there's a resolution process put in place, which we have, and we'll see how that plays out. Thirdly, I'd say when it comes to Mexico, protecting cheese names, common cheese names. I mean, we got side letters agreeing to that, and now it's just a matter of staying on top of it and working with the Mexican government to make sure these things play out good. So those three things, I think, are important moving forward.
Thank you very much. And Dr. McMurray Heath, good to see you. Biotechnology certainly has the potential to help us increase our productivity while helping farmers address the climate crisis, certainly. If we want to make the most of that potential and provide certainty for farmers and consumers and trading partners, I agree we need regulatory systems that are effective, science-based, and transparent, both here and abroad. And I also agree that we need an agriculture negotiator as soon as possible to help with this. I've long raised concerns both with China's opaque biotechnology approval process, and it's now concerning to see Mexico making decisions that don't seem to be grounded in science and causing long delays in biotechnology approvals. So I wonder if you might just speak a little bit more about the real-world consequences that decisions like these by our trading partners can have, and the impact on producers and future innovation.
Thank you so much, Senator Stabenow, and thank you for your continued efforts to really demonstrate how biotechnology can lead to improvements through climate change and pest resilience. So China's opaque trade practices have been a very difficult path for our biotechnology companies for quite some time. On average, it takes our companies 7 years to get their products approved through China. And we estimated that this has cost over $50 billion just in a 5-year period recently for U.S. farmers. So this is incredibly important to address, and we have every reason to believe that a similar analysis that we are conducting now will show similar results in Mexico. So our innovators need certainty, and they need a path open to science that is sound. That is all we're asking for. And we think that will aid not just our farmers, but it will help us address hunger and reduce climate change.
Thank you. I agree.
Thank you, Senator Stabenow. We're going to go at least through a reading of everyone, and I believe we'll be able to accommodate everyone quickly. The next person is Senator Grassley. I believe he's not available. After Senator Grassley is Senator Cantwell. I believe she's not available now, which means Senator Cornyn, who is available.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Huttman, when you say that in farm country a deal is a deal, apparently that doesn't necessarily apply to international trade agreements like the USMCA. I think we can all agree about the importance that the chairman and others have placed on enforcement. And certainly I would say that we ought to prioritize, ask the U.S. Trade Representative to prioritize all these dispute resolutions and discussions with our Mexican and Canadian counterparts and not just rely on the USMCA, what it says. The former Justice Scalia used to point out that the Soviet Union had one of the most highfalutin sounding constitutions in the world, but because they didn't have an enforcement mechanism through an independent judiciary, it didn't really mean much. So I agree with all my colleagues that we need to get the USTR to emphasize the dispute resolution and enforcement provisions. I particularly want to state my concerns about how Mexico is favoring state-owned oil companies and eliminates really the intent of the USMCA in dealing with these companies on a level playing field. I was one of 19 senators who wrote a bipartisan letter to President Lopez Obrador, and he basically blew us off, which unfortunately reinforces what I said a moment ago. We need these enforcement mechanisms rather than just the rhetoric and language that people use when we pass these trade agreements. I also want to associate myself with the comments of Senator Crapo when it came to the process by which the USMCA passed into law. Basically, the Senate Finance Committee, the primary committee that was responsible for trade agreements in Congress, was excluded from the process by the then USTR. And I think that exclusion jeopardizes the integrity and future of Trade Promotion Authority, which is delegated constitutional authority. So let me get to something more specific, Mr. Davis. I know that Labor had significant concerns that were addressed by proposals made by the chairman and Senator Brown. I was a party to an op-ed piece with Senator Carper, who's the chairman of the Trade Subcommittee in the Finance Committee, that we encourage the administration to revisit the Trans-Pacific Partnership in some form. As everybody knows, our competition with China looms large for our country, and the one thing we have that China does not have is friends. And I do believe that we would have more leverage dealing with China if we worked with our friends and partners in the region. But specifically, what I wanted you to answer, Mr. Davis, is what would it take for organized labor to support a multilateral, regional, and comprehensive trade agreement in the Asia-Pacific?
Thank you, Senator. I think from Labor's point of view, we're a long way from there.
Give me something specific on how we can get closer.
We have the first steps of a worker-centered trade policy, as Ambassador Tai frames it, and we're very supportive of that approach. That's going to take very strong enforcement and, frankly, much stronger when we get outside of places like Mexico, where we have long historic relationships, not always easy ones, but they're there. And where we get into countries that have non-market economies that are hurting American workers, that are countries that are dumping steel and aluminum, today. into our markets. So we're going to have a lot more enforcement, as has been mentioned a couple of times. And we're going to have a much more critical approach to folks who define themselves as our friends, but then want to take money out of our bank account.
Well, I know when China became part of the WTO, there was a hope that they would join the other rules-based international order in actually complying with their agreements. Unfortunately, they have a history of not complying with their agreements and stealing our intellectual property and committing other violations of norms and laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Cornyn. Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A very important hearing. We had a chance to discuss some of this last night when a few of us met with the ambassador from Canada in their embassy downtown. I'm going to start with Dr. McMurray-Heath. 2 months ago, the Finance Committee hearing, I asked Ambassador Tai about Mexico's failure to adhere to the USMCA commitments and issue broad biotech import approvals and its recent decree to phase out GMO corn. I was pleased to see Ambassador Tai follow through with her commitment and raise the issue in meetings earlier this month in Mexico City. Unfortunately, it looks like Mexico will not work with the U.S. in good faith effort to resolve the issue and ensure Iowa farmers full access to Mexican markets. What steps should USTR take in regard to the enforcement actions in Mexico's treatment of agricultural biotechnology?
Thank you, Senator Grassley, for the question, and thank you so much for your leadership and your urging to Ambassador Tai to address the issue. This was a very important first step. However, as you know, more is needed, and we really think it's time for the USTR to begin taking enforcement action by appointing an agricultural negotiator. We greatly appreciate Ambassador Tai and Secretary Vilsack's efforts to date to try to engage and address this issue with the Mexican government. However, an enforcement case would at the minimum give us a framework and a timeline to resolve the COFEPRIS regulated delays in biotechnology approvals and the December 31st, 2020 decree against biotech crops. So this is incredibly important that we address this now with the government of Mexico so this bad problem doesn't go from bad to worse.
Yeah. You know, there's an Iowan, Dr. Norman Borlaug, who passed away at age 95, but he did a lot of agricultural biotech research, and he did a lot of it in Mexico. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize, presumably for his research saving over 1 billion people from starvation. And for those who don't know much about agriculture, could you share some other benefits of using genetically modified crops?
Certainly. We're facing hunger and nutritional shortages globally. Our technologies are able to use biotech to create pest-resistant crops. This cuts down on the need for pesticides. It increases crop yields. It makes it a lot more sensitive to impacting the climate. And all of this helps us get more crops out to more people. If you look at short stature corn, that's a crop that's designed to resist windstorms and make the crops much more high yield when it comes to withstanding the weather changes that we are witnessing to date. So these technologies are incredibly important. We use science in almost every other setting to improve our lives, and this is just another area where science can lead to huge benefits.
Yeah. Mr. Hadama, USMCA fundamentally changed Canada's trade distorting policies and reforms Canada's dairy pricing system, including by eliminating its Class 7 program. However, we know that these changes only take place if fully enforced. I was glad to see that in May, USTR announced that the agency will request a dispute settlement panel be established to consider Canada's failure to comply with tariff rate quota provisions. does USMCA adequately protect American-made dairy products?
If the spirit of the trade deal is upheld, yes, it could, but the way the Canadian government and industry up there is behaving, it circumvents what we've put in place. So as of today, no. So enforcement is needed.
Also, for you, are there other areas besides Canada's dairy TRQ provisions where you would like to see USTR take action?
Absolutely. When it comes to exports of product out of Canada, specifically milk protein isolates and skim milk powders, action is needed there as well. There were caps put in place, and they are creating products to circumvent that agreement as well.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, could I have one more question, please?
Sure.
Okay. To Mr. Davis, do you think closing down the Enbridge Line 5 pipeline would do the same damage to U.S.-Canadian relations and cause Americans to lose their jobs?
Yes, sir. We very much support keeping that pipeline open. Our members have been fighting hard for that.
Thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. The next three in order are Senator Menendez, Senator Thune, and Senator Carper, and then we've been joined by additional colleagues. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If the United States is going to successfully diversify away from China, we need to continue to deepen our trading relationships with our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. And when it comes to addressing the challenges of migration in Central America, it's critical that we use all the tools at our disposal, including trade and economic development. So taking a fresh look at DR-CAFTA is a natural part of both of those efforts, I believe. So while we still need time to judge the effectiveness of all the changes, are there any USMCA provisions that you believe should be included or expanded upon in an updated DR-CAFTA?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Menendez. It's a very important question, and obviously a lot of people are thinking about, is this a model? Is it the floor? Is it the ceiling? We think that USMCA, as we understand it right now, is a floor for enforcement. But certainly the kinds of programs that are being talked about for Central America should be addressing the serious violations of worker rights that exist throughout that region. And so it does concern us a little bit that, asking the sort of pitch to bring in private investment, recognizing that the Central American countries have weak labor enforcement capacity and weak laws in many cases, does raise a lot of concerns about whether this is really going to be effective in either improving living standards or as any kind of deterrent to migration. We need a lot more work.
Mm-hmm. Dr. McMurray?
It's very important that we get CAFTA to focus on provisions that enhance cooperation with biotech. We really need to see our biotech innovations sent around the globe and have open access to markets around the globe.
Let me ask you all, as you may know, Nicaragua is a DR-CAFTA country. In recent months, Nicaragua's Ortega's regime has arrested 6 presidential candidates, over a dozen prominent leaders from the private sector and civil society. We have not seen an authoritarian crackdown of this nature in our hemisphere in decades. When Congress passed DR-CAFTA, I don't think anyone expected it would end up with the United States extending trade benefits to an authoritarian regime. So do any of you believe that when we're faced with this kind of situation, when we have a trade agreement partner that makes a sharp authoritarian turn, that they should continue to receive all the benefits of that agreement?
Senator, I think any kind of violation of human rights, including labor rights, is something that we have to take very seriously. We have to look at the mechanisms, whether that's Nicaragua or whether that's Guatemala or El Salvador, where there have been very serious labor rights violations and human rights violations as well, and Honduras, where human rights defenders have been killed. So we have to, that has to be the frame through which we look at all of these agreements.
You know, all of you, either from a labor or from a business perspective, want to deal with countries that not only observe the rule of law, but if there is a dispute, an intellectual property is a dispute on a contract, you can believe that you have a good opportunity to actually have that dispute fairly litigated in a court. But when you have authoritarian rule, courts are not a question of the due process and the rule of law. So I personally believe the United States has to incorporate standards into future trade agreements to safeguard against the deterioration of democratic governance and the proliferation of corruption and human rights abusers. Dr. McMurray Heath, I know your organization has been closely watching the administration's work on the TRIPS waiver. Details on the scope, time frame, and other factors are going to be critical to make sure we get the outcome we all want. More vaccines distributed to those who need them, but of course with the appropriate safeguards. Can you describe your interactions with the administration in this issue? Have you been consulted as USTR develops their negotiating process?
Thank you, Senator. We have met with USTR, but in doing so, we made it clear that while well-intentioned, the TRIPS waiver actually will not solve the issue of getting more vaccines, COVID vaccines, into more people around the globe. We completely agree that it is a humanitarian priority and imperative that we do so, and no one is safe until everyone is safe from COVID. But IP is not the rate-limiting step. Rather, our Global Share initiative, which we can submit into the record, outlines really pragmatic steps we can take today to have the 3 to 5 year delay it would take to actually build new manufacturing facilities that don't already exist, but it would allow our companies to fully use the 70 global manufacturing partnerships that they have in place today and give them the supplies and raw materials to manufacture really compliant vaccines and safe vaccines for patients around the globe tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. The next two, Senator Thune is with us, and Senator Carper will be online. And
Senator Cassidy?
Pardon me?
Senator Cassidy?
We've got the way the order is now, we have Senator Thune, Senator Carper, Senator Toomey, Senator Brown, Senator Cassidy, and what we're doing is just calling through in order of appearance.
I was here at gavel down.
You were here at gavel down. Well, this is in order of appearance, but let me follow it up with you, and let's just keep moving, okay? All right. Senator Thune and Senator Carper.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. While the focus of this hearing is on USMCA, I want to reiterate my concern that it's almost August and there's still not a nominee for Chief Ag Negotiator at USTR. It's an issue I've raised with Ambassador Tai and more recently with other USTR nominees. The lack of an ag negotiator is deeply concerning to farmers and ranchers in South Dakota and across the country, and I strongly encourage the administration to fill this role as soon as possible. And in that vein, I would like to ask you, Dr. McMurray Heath, can you tell us about the importance of having a chief ag negotiator to better engage with Mexico and Canada? And beyond the USMCA, how would having a chief ag negotiator benefit U.S. workers and businesses?
Well, it's very important that we hold all of our trade partners to our trade agreements. And many of our USMCA is really setting the gold standard for science-based trade policies and making sure that our regulators are paying attention to the science rather than misplaced concerns when judging our biotechnology crops. An ag negotiator, a chief ag negotiator at USTR would be our point person on this and would have the most pivotal influence to make sure that these points are made with all of our important trading partners. But even in the absence of a USTR chief negotiator, it's an imperative that we act now to try to right some of the missteps that we're seeing so far in the implementation of USMCA.
So as a number of my colleagues I think have mentioned, Trade Promotion Authority expired less than a month ago. TPA is critical to opening markets, expanding opportunities for American workers, businesses, farmers, and consumers. TPA was instrumental in the successful passage of USMCA, and it keeps the U.S. leading in trade, which is why its renewal is so important. Dr. McMurray Heath, how significant is renewing TPA to your industry and more broadly to our economy?
It's critically important, and BIO is fully supportive of renewing TPA. You know, one of the things that we desperately need in both our multilateral and bilateral trade agreements is that we modernize U.S. trade policy and pay close attention to intellectual property. You know, BIO represents a lot of small companies as well as large companies, and for many of our small companies, their intellectual property, their ingenuity, is perhaps their most valuable resource. And until our trade policies fully recognize that and protect that around the globe, then all of our businesses and the investors that support them are at risk.
There are a number of cheese producers in South Dakota who rely on generic names like Asiago and Parmesan to market their product not only in Mexico and Canada, but around the world. In a side letter to USMCA, there was a list of common cheese names to be protected from the EU's abuse of geographical indications. Mr. Huttema, could you share insight into how the EU goes about utilizing or seizing these common names, and how much of a concern is this to U.S. producers?
Yes, Senator, thank you. It is a very important issue for American producers and processors. The EU goes about this not only when it comes to cheese, but meat and wine and a host of other products. And they essentially do it to have the consumers in those countries not be able to recognize what truly is a cheese that is exactly the same. So when it comes to producers in South Dakota that export some of these cheeses, they'd have to relabel, remarket, and consumers would be totally unaware of what they would be buying. So EU definitely does do this as a practice to try to, you know, withhold us from certain markets. And in the case of USMCA and Mexico, those side letters were very helpful.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Ms. McCurry-Heath, Mexico is consistently the top market for U.S. corn exports, valued at $3 billion last year. Our farmers and ranchers were some of the strongest advocates for passage of USMCA. However, farmers in my state are concerned that Mexico is backsliding on its USMCA commitments because they've not approved any new biotech crops since the treaty was ratified last year. And in fact, Mexico has not approved any biotech crop traits since May of 2018. So can you speak to this issue and what impact it may have on U.S. corn farmers when it comes to trade with Mexico?
Certainly, Senator. This is an incredibly important issue. To see the breakdown of an important global regulator like COFEPRIS to the point where they're not approving not only biotechnology, agricultural crops, but also biopharmaceutical products is almost unheard of. And it creates such uncertainty in this very interlinked and interrelated global marketplace. When we see a breakdown in our ability to innovate in corn crops in the U.S., to export to Mexico, that also impacts our ability to innovate for almost all other markets, including our own. We need certainty and we need action to make sure these innovations have a path forward, as long as they're proved safe and effective.
Thank you.
Our next three will, Senator Carper will go next, and then Toomey, Brown, and Cassidy in order of appearance. Senator Carper.
Before I ask a question or two, could I say a word about Mike Enzi?
Of course.
Yes. I remember when I was a brand new member of the Senate, 20 years or so ago, that I ended up presiding over the Senate. And one of the people who asked for recognition was Mike Enzi, who I really didn't know. And he spoke for a while. He was the senior Republican on the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee. And the senior Democrat was Ted Kennedy. And he talked that day about how the two of them were able to get a lot done and accomplish a lot by working together. And he mentioned in his remarks, he mentioned the 80-20 rule. I didn't know. I've heard of the 80-20 rule in other contexts, but I didn't know what he was talking about. So I gave a note to a page and asked him to come and talk to me when he finished before he left the floor. And he did. And while somebody else was speaking, I said, "What is the 80-20 rule?" And he said that it's what the rule that guides Ted Kennedy and me. I said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "Ted and I agree on about 80% of the stuff before our committee, and we disagree on maybe 20% of the stuff. And what we've decided to do is focus on the 80% where we agree, and the 20% where we disagree, we'll come back and deal with that another day." And when I mourn, along with our colleagues and the people, Wyoming when I mourn the passing of Mike Enzi. I always think about the 80-20 rule. And it's something that's guided me for the past 20 years. And it's something that as we try to come to conclusion and a good resolution with respect to infrastructure, different kind of proposals that are before us, maybe we should remember Mike Enzi in that 80-20 rule. So thank you for letting me say that. I want to thank our witnesses today for all of you for joining us. About a year after since the USMCA entry into force, as chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee today, protecting the air, protecting our water, our land that we all share is of utmost priority to me, and I know the members of our committee, and I think the members of the Senate. I was proud to work with many of our colleagues in the House and Senate to help develop the environmental provisions in the USMCA, which are the most comprehensive of any U.S. trade agreement, and which I think will serve as a model on negotiations and other trade agreements as we go forward. I believe that trade policy is one of the best tools to protect our environment and work with our allies on shared environmental goals. However, in order for these environmental provisions to be more than just words on a piece of paper, they must be enforced. Ms. Lowell, could you take a moment to share with us some of the areas of progress between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico when it comes to addressing these environmental commitments, please?
Sure. Well, we were certainly happy to see environment have its own chapter in the USMCA, and really believe that enforcement of trade measures is important, because without enforcement, we just have a wish list of what we'd like to see, rather than what's binding commitments of real change happening, either on the water, inland, or with the environment. And so some items that have happened since the USMCA has been implemented for the past year. There have been two places where the public has actually raised a submission to the committee. The USMCA provides a mechanism for the general public to take action if they believe an environmental law is not being effectively enforced by the US, Canada, or Mexico. So anyone can file a submission on enforcement matters when they see something that's not happening. So just a couple of examples that have happened since 2020. There have been two submissions following this process. The first was in Mexico, highlighting where the Mexican government was not following its rules to protect loggerhead sea turtles in the Atlantic and Pacific. So that's an example of, someone raising, you need to do more, Mexican government. And secondly, in Canada, there was a submission regarding to the Port Authority that they were not following their process, similar to our NEPA process, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, on taking in the impacts of expanding a port in British Columbia. So I think both of these examples show that the mechanisms can work, where the general public can raise areas where they see that the countries need to do better. And I really encourage the Senate Finance Committee and others in the Senate and in Congress to really help push on the U.S. to do better in our own areas, as well as identify ways that we can push on our trade partners to ensure that they're enforcing their laws. Because again, we don't want the environmental chapter just to be a wish list of things that would be nice to do, but actually binding commitments are what the countries are doing.
Thank you, Ms. Thank you for that response. Let me just a quick follow-up, if I could, Ms. Lowell. The USMCA Implementation Act included significant funding, as you'll recall, for environmental monitoring and enforcement. However, some stakeholders have raised concerns about transparency on the use of these funds. And could you just take a moment and discuss what additional transparency is needed to give us recommendations on where we should enhance our focus when it comes to the use of these funds?
Sure. So specifically on for NOAA, with got money for implementation of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program and addressing IUU provisions. We've yet to see how that money's been spent, so would love to have NOAA report to you all and the public of how they've used those resources to improve implementation of the USMCA's IUU provisions, and including it included money to build capacity in Mexico as well. The resources were definitely needed. NOAA outlined in its own report in June that it was limited in resources and implementation of that program that helps keep illegal product out of the U.S. And so we feel like that 8 million should have given them a significant investment in the infrastructure to make the program successful, and have not seen to date how that's been spent.
Okay, and one more quick one. Mr. Davis, would you please share with us some thoughts on how the labor and environmental reporting mechanisms have functioned since the USMCA entered into force, as well as some opportunities for the continued improvement, please? And just briefly.
Yeah, it's a big improvement. I'd say we're still having difficulty getting data on a lot of metrics from Mexico, and that's a concern that the board raised in its report. So we need to do some more work in that area.
Okay, and Ms. Lowell, I'll follow up with you a question for the record on the same question, if I could. Our thanks to all very, very much. It's important stuff, and we're great. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Senator Cassidy.
Mr. Davis, I'm going to ask you a couple questions that may seem far afield and are questions I don't have the answer to, which will make it more interesting. I read that there was a problem of China sending steel and aluminum through Mexico as if it was being made in Mexico, but merely it was a pass-through to our nation, circumventing, if you will, other rules. Do I remember that correctly?
Yes, sir.
And how does USMCA address that?
Actually, we've been trying to address that through a number of pieces of legislation which have been proposed, and through the government's enforcement of current anti-dumping and circumvention rules. And we're very pleased that the administration has been with us in fighting steel dumping, aluminum dumping, which affect our members directly, affect members in other manufacturing unions, and
can I ask you just
our critical supply chains.
Is there any evidence of complicity in the Mexico government that they would be turning a blind eye towards Chinese aluminum and steel being dumped into our nation, passing through Mexico? Are they cooperating in determining this?
I'm not sure I have the details to give you a direct answer to that.
Okay. The other thing, again, this seems far afield, and I may ask Ms. Lowell this as well. We speak of Mexico's compliance with labor laws and with environmental regulations. There's a certain cost associated with that. We know that. That's okay. But China does not enforce such regulations. The absence of enforcement, therefore, results in effectively a subsidy given to people who wish to locate their manufacturing plants there. Again, they don't have the cost of compliance with labor or environmental laws. But in turn, China seems to violate both with seeming impunity. Any thoughts on that?
We don't have a level playing field with non-market economies, and we've supported legislation that would address that more directly.
How could we address the absence of environmental enforcement in our labor law enforcement in China, again, thereby giving the playing field an advantage tilted towards them vis-a-vis Mexico, us, and others?
We have to keep those subsidies, direct and indirect, from filtering into our market, sometimes through our legitimate trading partners, but we can't let China get away with that.
Yeah. Ms. Lowell, any thoughts on that, which I just asked Mr. Davis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think China is really putting our U.S. fishermen at a disadvantage, and it comes down to putting import controls in place that ensure that any seafood coming into the U.S. is legally caught and produced legally, which means not using forced labor or other human rights abuses. Oceana strongly believes that more transparency and documentation on seafood products coming in can help just make a condition of import that it's legal. So the Seafood Import Monitoring Program right now only applies to 13 types of seafood, which are not some of the ones that are also involved.
Let me stop, because I
Sure.
think we're in total agreement on most things. I represent a bunch of shrimp fishermen and shrimpers in Louisiana. Now, one thing I will say, though, practically speaking, shrimp is 80% of what we import. If you're going to put in systems and you initially aspire to do everything, it seems like you're going to overwhelm your system as opposed to starting in that which is highest volume / most problematic and then growing in capability. Would you agree, disagree?
I disagree with that. I think the information flow should apply to everything.
Yes,
And
but
where
do
you
we have,
target
it isn't that we shouldn't, it's just do we have the capability to start and immediately go to scale on everything?
that information allows you to target the shipments at
You're
the
missing
highest
my
risk.
point. The question is how rapidly can we scale? Not that ideally we wouldn't do it, but rather, I mean, I'll move on just because I'm not sure it's worth belaboring. Ms. Murray, I'm not sure that you've probably already been asked this. I apologize. I've been in another committee hearing. How has Mexico complied with respecting IP vis-a-vis our biologics, if you will, pharmaceuticals?
I wish I had the answer to that question, Senator, but because they have not so far actually approved our agricultural biotech crops, it's been difficult to see with really some of our cutting edge innovations. So far, that's an area of concern, and we keep watching it. But we'd love to see more innovations going into Mexico that we could then safeguard the intellectual.
But under the terms of the treaty, they are supposed to approve that, correct?
Yes.
Okay, with that, I yield back. Thank you.
I thank my colleague. Our next two are Senator Bennett, and then Senator Young, who I believe is online, and then Senator Casey. Senator Young, are you online?
I am, Chairman. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, I welcome our panelists. The USMCA is a landmark agreement. It's critical to our economic success. In the state of Indiana, we are the most manufacturing intensive state in the country and also one of the nation's top 10 states for ag exports. And looking at corn and soybean production, 87% of this year's corn acreage was planted with biotech varieties in Indiana. And 91% of soybean acres were planted using biotech varieties. Ultimately, Mexico has taken steps that threaten the market reliability for ag products. No biotech approvals have been issued in over 2 years. Executive decrees also attempt to phase out the use of genetically engineered foods. And in case anyone is in need of a reminder, biotech allows crops to withstand drought, pests, flooding, all while increasing yields and therefore reducing the prices of these important commodities and reducing the need for herbicide application. So it leads to a healthier environment and also a healthier product. Dr. McMurray-Heath, given what the science says about the benefits of biotech, what's at stake to our farmers and innovators should Mexico's decree be implemented?
Thank you so much, Senator, for the question. And yes, there is a lot at stake. Biotechnology really allows our agricultural innovators to develop new crops that can withstand the global warming that we've seen to date and prevent future global warming going forward. We've seen so far that there's been such an impact to this kind of uncertainty in terms of trying to get the investment needed to really speed those innovations. And those innovations are critical. We have a company called Benson Hill who is trying to use CRISPR, a technology that just won the Nobel Prize in Science, to engineer, very specific, high nutrition, high resilient crops that can be grown in almost any hydroponic setting in any small neighborhood or low income area. This could allow us to address hunger. It could allow us to get more nutritious foods to inner city and poor communities in the U.S. But the hampering of this technology at the international trade level is also hampering our domestic ability to use these technologies to help Americans and others around the globe.
Well, that's an incredibly compelling testimony at a time when there's much discussion here in Washington, across the country, and back home in Indiana about the price of our food. Inflation is among the greatest concerns for my constituents, and we're talking about something that actually could increase the cost of food, is increasing the cost of food. How might these delays be impacting? We'll move beyond the consumer level and just talk about the ag sector more generally. how are the delays impacting the ag sector, particularly for states in the Corn Belt?
Yeah, so we've started to look deeply into this question with Mexico, but we can use China as an example. In 2018, BIO and our international partners conducted an extensive economic analysis on the impact of regulatory delays in China, where it takes on average 7 years for our new agricultural crops to get improved. This has cost the U.S. nearly 34,000 jobs between 2011 and 2016. So we can see that these trade agreements have a real-world impact on Americans' earning capabilities and job opportunities, not to mention global warming, nutrition, and hunger.
In hunger, something that's being exacerbated by the COVID pandemic with supply chain challenges and even some challenges at the production level. We see the number of people across the world on the verge of starvation spiking. How can Congress be helpful to Ambassador Tai and her role over at USTR in seeking a resolution to this issue before irreversible harm is caused?
Well, we appreciate the bipartisan efforts to date to really support Ambassador Tai and her efforts to try to negotiate with the Mexican government. But it's critically important that we see movements like the appointment of a chief agricultural negotiator for USTR so that we can enhance our efforts and show the Mexican government that we're serious about these concerns and that they must be addressed urgently.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm out of time.
I thank my colleague, Senator Casey, and we're going to try and see if we can get Senator Casey, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Hassan, and Senator Cortez Masto in before we have to go vote. Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. I want to join a lot of our colleagues in across the Senate in noting the passing of Senator Mike Enzi. I had a longer commentary in the Help Committee just a few minutes ago, but I did want to say how saddened we were about the accident that he suffered, and then the terrible and tragic passing of Mike Enzi. Probably the best way to describe Mike Enzi is he was a paragon of decency in a town where that quality is in short supply, and we're just thinking of his family and praying for Mike. We'll miss him more, I guess, as a human being than anything else, but of course as a colleague as well. I also want to commend the chairman for not only calling this hearing to focus on USMCA and implementation, but also to commend Chairman Wyden's work to get this agreement done. I realize it was work done by the previous administration, but that agreement would be well short of what I could have supported were it not for the work of Chairman Wyden and Senator Brown and others in the House and the Senate, so I want to commend them. Mr. Davis, I'll start with you. I'll be introducing soon the Market Economy Sourcing Act, and that'll be with Senators Brown and Warren. This legislation establishes a supplemental rule of origin for non-market economies like China that can ensure that countries like China cannot free ride on trade agreements. As you know, half of all content under existing rules of origin can come from countries outside of those participating in a trade agreement. This means a significant share of content for goods receiving preferential market access under a trade agreement can come from communist countries like China. Half of the content. That's not only counterproductive, but it can further enmesh our supply chains, including critical supply chains, with those of the Chinese Communist Party. So, Mr. Davis, my question for you is, can you discuss how implementation of policy like that embedded in the bill I'm introducing will help, number one, secure supply chains, number two, contribute to high standards, and number three, curb free riding from communist countries on trade agreements?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And the steelworkers are very proud to have endorsed this legislation, which you're sponsoring. In fact, I think under TPP, it would actually have allowed up to 60% of an automobile content to come from outside member countries, including non-market economies, as you stated. So this is really fundamental toward reinvesting in American workforce and in our critical supply chains so that we don't, so that we're prepared for the next pandemic or the next chip shortage or all the things that are really weighing down on the growth of our economy and the possibility of expanding the income of our workers at this point.
I want to thank you, and thanks for your work on this and your scholarship in this area, as well as your service to the country. And also, the last thing I wanted to ask you about was if you could discuss how you're working to ensure that the work you're doing in the context of both labor and labor rights is being employed to support all workers, including women and historically disadvantaged communities. Are you ensuring, or I should say, how are you ensuring that women are included at the table from the outset with regard to both the engagement and consultation process? Senator Cortez Masto and I have worked on this with a number of our colleagues, and just wanted to get your comments on that. And I'll be done after that.
Thank you, Senator. That's a fundamental issue. That's something that the whole labor movement is 100% behind. And I think, in the USMCA case specifically, there's some interesting things. For example, Mexican labor law now requires that there be a gender proportionality in the elected leadership of trade unions. That's more progressive than what we have in the U.S., although we're trying to get there on our own. Making sure that there's compliance with that, and making sure that other legislation that prohibits pregnancy testing, particularly in the maquiladoras. This is a problem that's been going on, for decades. It's well documented, but we know it's still happening, and we look forward to using this mechanism to push back on that.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Casey. And I remember coming to Pennsylvania to listen to working families on these issues, and you and Senator Cortez Masto have both been wonderful advocates. Here's where we are. We are going to try to get everybody in and still make this vote. I think Senator Whitehouse may be online. Is that right? Okay. Senator Hassan, are you online? Senator Cortez Masto is here, and colleagues, what we're going to do for those who are here and who are listening, Senator Crapo should be arriving soon, then I'll go vote. We'll just keep it going. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, the panelists. Thank you for being here today. Mr. Hadema, is that pronounced that right? Close enough. All right. Farming and ranching is the lifeblood of much of the rural economy in my home state of Nevada. It's actually responsible for about $1.5 billion in economic output and over 8,000 jobs across the state of Nevada. It is critical that we ensure that our USMCA partners adhere to the dairy provisions they agreed to, as USTR did in initiating a dispute settlement over Canada's tariff rate quotas. My question to you is, what additional steps should we take to work with USTR to ensure that Canada is abiding by the protections for U.S. dairy farmers provided for in the USMCA?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. So a big part of what needs to be done is just oversight and monitoring. So when it comes to them skirting issues, I don't believe that will ever stop. So organizations like National Milk Producers, IDFA, are in that arena and see what is going on. So it is a matter of, it will be constant monitoring of what's going on. So USTR is a small group. They don't have a large workforce that they can go out and do this. I think we have to count on the organizations in place to provide that information.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Davis, you mentioned in your testimony that the Independent Mexico Labor Expert Board's July 7th report on the USMCA implementation raised concerns about 4 areas: transparency, contract legitimation process, budgeting and staffing of Mexico's new labor institutions, and U.S. technical cooperation. I'm curious, of these four concerns, which would you say is the most crucial to focus on in order to facilitate the shift which you identify from protection unions towards democratic labor organizations?
It's a really hard question, Senator, and so let me try to answer it this way. I think there's three key things that we need. We need strong enforcement, and Brown-Wyden sets the floor, and we need to be going up from that floor and making sure that works effectively. We need to support the process that Mexico has started of creating new labor market institutions and new domestic enforcement mechanisms. And we need to help workers build their own capacity because democratic labor movement in Mexico has been repressed for 50 years at least. And, they don't just come out. There's some great folks, but they don't come out overnight with the ability to come and, use the rapid response mechanism and other tools or even the domestic law. So I can't really say one's more important than the other because if we don't do all three, it's going to be an unbalanced stool and it's going to fall over. But I'm confident that we can do all three things.
Thank you. Again, thank you to the panel members. So appreciate the conversation today. I yield the remainder of my time.
I thank my colleagues. So calling again in order of appearance, Senator Sass, Senator Scott, and Senator Warren is here. Senator Warren, because you and I both have to vote, here is Senator Brown. All right. Senator Brown, have you voted? I have not. All right. What I will do is Senator Warren was going to go next. Let's have Senator Warren go next for 5 minutes and Senator Brown go next, and I will, meanwhile, go vote and get back so my colleagues can vote. Senator Warren, and then Senator Warren, and then Senator Brown.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So for too long, our trade rules have undercut workers, promoting offshoring and a global race to the bottom in labor and environmental standards. Rules get written this way because our trade process is rigged in favor of corporate interests. But it's not just the negotiation of new deals that puts corporate profits ahead of workers. It's also the enforcement of existing rules. Mr. Davis, our trade officials haven't bothered to put many enforceable labor protections in our trade agreements, but they also don't have a good track record of enforcing the few labor standards that we do have. The U.S. Trade Rep and the Department of Labor, the agencies that share responsibility here, have historically been very slow and very hesitant to bring any labor cases. So let me start with this, Mr. Davis. I want to focus for a minute on the track record prior to the USMCA, the trade deal that we're discussing today. Before the USMCA, how many times had the U.S. brought a labor violation case under a trade agreement?
Once.
One. Only one labor case ever among the 100-plus trade disputes that the U.S. has ever initiated. And that one labor case happened more than 2 years after the AFL-CIO complaint was filed in 2008. It then took another 5 years after the case was finally brought to get a final ruling, which, by the way, was that the union and the workers were right all those years ago. Guatemala had failed to enforce its labor law, but it could get away with it on a technicality. Mr. Davis, I think it's fair to say that this is a very, very poor rate of enforcement actions because there aren't many complaints about labor violations in the first place. Is that the reason that we have such a bad record here? No. So numerous labor issues have languished for years with only one enforcement action, which brings me to the USMCA. A key improvement secured with leadership from Chairman Wyden and Senator Brown is the rapid response labor mechanism, which ensures that workers get relief in months, not years or never. Under this mechanism, when the U.S. government receives a complaint that workers' rights are being violated in a Mexican factory, for example, it has 30 days to determine whether there is sufficient credible evidence of a violation. If there is, USTR must initiate a complaint with Mexico. USTR has already done this once, so they've already matched the standard of the previous years under the earlier trade agreement, and it's done this based on a complaint from American and Mexican unions. This piece of USMCA is a step in the right direction, but enforcing the rules shouldn't be limited to just one part of one trade deal. So, Mr. Davis, would it help if the U.S. government committed to reviewing and acting upon any complaint that a trading partner is violating any labor commitment within, say, months instead of years or never?
Senator, I think that's certainly the direction that we'd like to see. I would just say we could go further. In the case of Xinjiang, we're using withhold release orders. That's for forced labor, and forced labor clearly has to be immediately addressed. But why is violation of freedom of association, firing hundreds or thousands of workers, or gender discrimination? I think forced labor is worse, but that doesn't mean that those others don't deserve a similarly rapid and effective response.
Well, I appreciate that very much, Mr. Davis. Any future trade agreements must include strong protections with automatic enforcement and automatic deadlines. But USTR and the Labor Department could decide right now to update their own rules to make sure that the Labor Department is responsive and fair in how they handle all labor complaints, not just those under the USMCA. If we want trade policy to actually start working for workers, we need to make the structural changes that ensure that workers' concerns are addressed in them. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Senator Crapo, and thanks to you and Senator Wyden for holding this hearing. Senator Warren, I thank you for the comments that you made. Thanks all of you for shining a light on the Brown-Wyden rapid response mechanism that many on this committee and both parties worked on. One step to reforming our country's approach to trade policy, a departure from what we've been. We are now looking at trade as worker-centered, and Mr. Huda might say farmer-centered rather than corporate-centered trade policy, and that's important. Ohioans know in my entire career I never voted for a single trade agreement until USMCA. Since NAFTA was enacted, thousands of workers, Dayton to Lordstown, Lorain to Fremont to Mansfield, where I grew up, saw $30 an hour manufacturing jobs move to Mexico, where workers made no more than a couple dollars an hour for the same work. Independent economists at the Economic Policy Institute noted that in the first 11 years of the agreement, we lost 1 million jobs across the country. Mr. Davis certainly knows this. Numerous studies have confirmed the agreement had only a modest impact overall in GDP. The Mexican media pays attention to this hearing. We know that. I want to speak directly to workers there and in the U.S. The Brown-Wyden rapid response mechanism, labor enforcement provisions were put in place to empower all workers to exercise their right to form a union, to alert us of any interference or strong-arm tactics of their labor rights. We've frankly seen that in both countries, in the United States and maybe in a bigger way in Mexico. Every worker should have a copy of her union contract. The success of this agreement depends on enforcement and implementation. So, Mr. Davis, my question is to you, and I enjoyed meeting you earlier briefly this morning. You raised concerns about implementation. Can you elaborate on the Independent Mexico Labor Exports Board's recommendation and what will need to take place to address them?
Senator, I would answer it this way to do it quickly. You remember that we had a problem at Goodyear. And workers were fired for trying to start an independent union. They have not gotten their jobs back, although some of them are still trying. The same protection union that was at that Goodyear plant is the protection union that's at the General Motors plant in Silao. And it may be that the workers, despite having the company having, 4 months and then the union having, a 4-month period to carry out this legitimation vote, they might still vote that contract down. But it's going to be real hard. They don't have a union. So even if they vote the contract down, Medina or another CTM union can come back the next day and try and get it. So this is, we're making progress here, but we have to do a lot more to push back on the protection union czars like Medina and some others who still control the Mexican labor force.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I want to make clear as we continue, and Senator Menendez had building on his comment question, that USMCA, most of us in this committee see USMCA as the minimum standard for trade agreements going forward, especially with countries that we do not have a long-standing relationship. We'll need much more robust enforcement of labor rights. Brown-Wyden is the basic position is so important. Speak to why this committee should view, Mr. Davis should view USMCA as the floor, not the ceiling for trade agreements around the world.
Just because of the risks that workers face on a daily basis, firing, blacklisting, pregnancy discrimination, which we mentioned, threats, beatings, murder. In Mexico, there's still 9 cases of trade unionists who've been killed, including an American, that are unresolved, some of these going back 10 or 15 years. Employers, whether it's in the U.S. or Mexico, know that it's quicker and cheaper to fire the union leaders and drag out the legal process rather than agreeing. And, we want to change that balance. There are a lot of workers not just in Mexico, but in Central America, in Colombia, another place with a terrible labor rights record, who share that vision and that ideal. Until now, they haven't had the tools to do it. We think that we're starting to get some of those tools, and we want to get to work and build it.
Good, thank you. One final point, Senator Crapo. It's vital to my state. Our trade policy only works for American industries if we take enforcement of dumping and overcapacity issues seriously. It's why I've introduced our bipartisan bill, Leveling the Playing Field 2.0, to update our trade remedy laws to make sure we're enforcing our trade laws against trade cheats around the world, including those who try to move product through Canada and Mexico to get around our laws. Senator Cassidy had brought up this point earlier. I thank the United Steelworkers for endorsing this bill. Thank you, Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Next, we have Senator Toomey with us remotely, I believe. Senator Toomey?
That's right. Thank you, Senator Crapo. The hearing today is about USMCA enforcement 1 year in, and several witnesses have alluded to the importance of what the Biden administration calls worker-centered trade policy. So let's take a look at the impact of this new USMCA and enforcement upon workers. USMCA NAFTA's biggest benefit to workers clearly comes from its trade liberalizing provisions. The American economy and the American workforce indisputably benefited enormously from NAFTA. U.S. exports to Mexico grew 5-fold. Under NAFTA, the U.S. consistently set new records year after year as the world's #1 manufacturer. Currently, 14 million U.S. jobs rely on trade with Canada and Mexico. There's over 500,000 such jobs in Pennsylvania alone. And these jobs pay on average 15 to 20% more than jobs that were lost. NAFTA already substantively liberalized almost all North American trade. There was complete reciprocity. We had zero tariff on 100% of manufactured goods, zero tariff on 97.5% of agricultural goods. Now, USMCA contains some narrow improvements upon NAFTA, like improved digital trade provisions and a very slightly expanded access to the Canadian dairy markets. But most of USMCA's new provisions moved us away from free trade and towards managed trade instead. Hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money are set to be spent in Mexico to monitor their environmental and labor practices. This is an egregious misuse of hard-earned taxpayer funds, footing the bill for a foreign country's enforcement of its own domestic laws. Now, for all this investment, what's been the impact? Well, the jobs impact that's projected is basically negligible. In 2019, the ITC report projecting the impacts of USMCA stated that on balance, if we leave out the positive effects of the digital trade provisions that increase certainty, The rest of the USMCA will restrict trade and cause employment in the United States to decline by 54,000 jobs. The primary reason for negotiating NAFTA was to reduce our trade deficit with Mexico by restricting free trade in autos. USMCA represents a misguided attempt to diminish Mexico's comparative advantage in some categories of auto production. So, are auto manufacturers flocking back to the U.S. after USMCA passed? Not really. And the U.S. trade deficit in goods with Mexico has gone up since USMCA passed. An ITC report written this year on the impact of trade agreement finds that on balance, there is simply no clear evidence of USMCA causing any overall shift in auto production in the U.S., and that's despite an extremely aggressive interpretation of the enhanced auto rules of origin and new, quote, labor value content, quote, provisions designed specifically to shift production to the U.S. Are any U.S. jobs gained from the rapid response labor mechanism or the environmental provisions? Not yet, unless you include the bureaucrats hired by the government for enforcement. In fact, the rapid response labor mechanism's only confirmed impact on American workers thus far is arguably negative. In my state, constituent jobs are at stake as an investigation continues into one of my constituents' Mexican subsidiary. The firm is given no details about the investigation and no recourse to defend themselves. Caught up in a fight between the Mexican and U.S. government in which they face substantial financial impact if the mechanism allows the U.S. to block their components at the border. Outside of the digital trade provisions, there's really very little evidence that USMCA's new provisions will be good for U.S. workers. What we do know is that trade liberalization helps workers. It creates high-paying jobs. It gives high-quality, low-cost choices to consumers. If the Biden administration wants to truly pursue a work-centered trade policy, they should focus on pursuing new FTAs, lowering tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade, expanding export markets. These are the policies that demonstrably increase high-quality job opportunities for U.S. workers. Free trade is the best mechanism that we know of to give the highest standard of living to the largest number of people. Over 39 million U.S. jobs, one out of every 5, exist thanks to foreign trade. The Biden administration should seek to expand that number by pursuing new trade liberalizing policies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Senator Whitehouse, I believe is online. Is that right?
Yep, I'm here and online.
And you voted.
And my
Go ahead.
questions are for Beth Lowell. So we're having a double online here, online senator and online witness. I'm very happy that Oceana is a part of this hearing, and I want to particularly thank Chairman Wyden for making sure that Oceana was a part of this hearing. Very often, in fact, almost without exception, on the occasions in which we get environmental conditions into trade agreements, the enforcement somehow manages never to appear. And I think the focus of this committee on the oceans provisions of USMCA is very helpful, and I'm grateful to the chairman for doing that, and grateful to you, Ms. Lowell, for testifying today. Your testimony focuses primarily on fisheries, and I'd like to get to that in a moment. But the USMCA also has a provision on marine litter, which is the language for marine plastic waste. By the way, I gather Paulita Bennett-Martin has just moved up to the plastics position at Oceana, which I'm very happy about, so congratulations. In Oceana's view, what has actually been accomplished pursuant to the marine litter provisions of the USMCA? Is there a place where we can identify a reduced pound of marine plastic waste as a result of this agreement and the enforcement provisions of it, or is most of that work ahead of us?
Thanks. It's good to see you today. I would say that we are very thankful for the investments that the USMCA implementing language had on marine debris, invested $8 million to help address the problem. We hope that Canada and Mexico are mirroring that with additional investments in their own countries. As we know, marine debris, marine litter is a huge problem. The flow of plastics into our ocean is just creating a storm out there. You know, the latest studies that we've seen on some of the cleanups have been since 2019. So I really can't see what happened in 2020. But in 2019, from the coastal cleanups around the world, the most prominent items on the beach, the top 10 found, were things like single-use plastics, like chip wrappers, bottle caps, stirrers, straws, lids, plates. That type of single-use plastic is really something that our countries could actually reduce the flow of pollutions in the water. We really need to reduce the production and use of single-use plastics. And, you know, the provisions in the USMCA don't require that, but it's something our countries could work collaboratively to address a problem that impacts not only our countries, but the health of the oceans.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think it's good that the USMCA mentioned marine litter, and it's good that there's funding, but I don't think we're at a point yet where we can identify a single pound of plastic that has been kept out of the oceans as a result of anything that has been done yet. So I think we continue to have a call to action as our oceans fill more and more and more with plastic waste that tends not to biodegrade. So over to your issue of fisheries. We've been focusing in the National Defense Authorization Acts on trying to improve the information flow to those who are trying to combat IUU fishing. And we're having, I would say, only moderate success. The Navy was not interested at all. The Coast Guard is somewhat interested. But as you know, there's quite a robust private and non-governmental network out there, led in many respects by Vulcan, to help provide information to people who are doing IUU enforcement. And we'd like to do what we can to strengthen that, if you have any advice on that. And second, we see China as a very significant abuser of fisheries all around the country. I traveled a lot with Senator McCain, and we went to various times the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and in every one of those countries, when we raised the issue of fishing, they were very upset at the way Chinese fishing vessels were behaving in their fishing waters, and the extent to which Chinese military and Coast Guard vessels provided physical protection for vessels that were fishing illegally, and that there were actually encounters between their sovereign vessels and Chinese sovereign vessels trying to interfere with enforcement in their waters. And there are other countries like East Timor that have communicated with us their same concerns. Could you comment a little bit on what we need to do next on IUU fishing?
Yeah, so really, I think transparency and documentation of fish products is primary. We really need to get every fish coming into the U.S. reporting who caught it, where they caught it, how they caught it, their authorization, to ensure that legality is a condition of import. And then also transparency, so that we can see where those vessels are, verify the information comes in, so that only fish that's legally caught and produced without using forced labor or other human rights abuses actually makes it into the U.S. And, you know, on the China issue, I really do think fisheries subsidies is a way to get to the Chinese fleet as well. We're happy to see the subsidies language in the USMCA and really encourage the U.S. to continue negotiations at the WTO to put stronger disciplines on fisheries subsidies. That's really driving the overcapacity of the distant water fishing fleets that are fishing right outside of coastal nations that don't have the ability to enforce their own waters. Some are IUU fishing, and it's really undermines U.S. fishermen that are very heavily regulated, that have some of the strongest management measures in the world, are competing in a marketplace with IUU fishing and the subsidized distant water fishing fleets.
Yeah, it's just not fair. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
I thank my colleagues. Senator Hassan is here.
Thank you, Senator Wyden.
I want to tell all our guests, this has been a hectic day, even by Senate standards. But Senator Hassan, you voted, So you can.
Actually, I haven't voted, but
Oh,
I
my
had
goodness.
2 other hearings, so I'm
Go.
going to quickly go,
Go.
and then we're going to go vote.
Great.
So I appreciate all of you very much, and I wanted to start with a couple of questions to you, Mr. Hadama. The USMCA expanded New Hampshire dairy farmers' access to the Canadian market by reforming its milk supply management system and dairy trade policies. In implementing this agreement, the U.S. also needs to monitor whether Canada responds to increased U.S. exports by selling below-cost milk into other markets, which could undercut competition. How do you expect Canada to respond to increased U.S. dairy exports, especially given the issues you raised in your testimony about Canadian progress in implementing dairy reforms?
If history repeats itself, I would expect them to just continue to export. I do not believe that, the dairy system in Canada is very regulated, and we're not against Canadian dairy farmers per se.
Right.
We're more about just maintaining their market and not interfering with ours. But they've had a history of trying to push more product.
Okay. Thank you. In addition to increasing access to the Canadian dairy market, New Hampshire dairy farmers have also highlighted the importance of the USMCA for boosting U.S. dairy exports to Mexico. Before the USMCA, trade tensions and retaliatory cheese tariffs from Mexico were costing U.S. dairy jobs and making it harder for our dairy farmers to compete. How did the passage of the USMCA and de-escalation of trade tensions help U.S. dairy exports to Mexico? And how have the concerning trade restrictions you mentioned in your testimony affected U.S. dairy exports since passage of the deal?
So the trade tensions before the deal were definitely hindering our exports and hurting our farmers. Since then, with the implementation of USMCA, it has definitely helped and helped raise prices as well. I think when it comes to Mexico, we can get a handle on it. We just have to be proactive and make sure that it happens.
Okay. I'd look forward to working with you on that. And then, Ms. Lowell, I just have one additional question, kind of building on what Senator Whitehouse was just talking about. Marine debris is a critical issue for humans, for wildlife. I, too, live in a coastal state where organizations like the Blue Ocean Society for Marine Conservation collected more than 6,000 pounds of litter from New Hampshire's beaches in 2019 alone. And I will just note that we have about 18 miles of coastline. So that's 6,000 pounds of litter from 18 miles of coastline in 2019. I'm grateful to Senators Whitehouse and Carper as champions of addressing this issue, and I'm glad that there was additional funding in the USMCA Implementation Act to support efforts to prevent, reduce, and remove marine debris across the country. But are there things, in addition to what you talked about in your answer to Senator Whitehouse, things we can do, efforts to encourage cooperation with our partners like Canada to ensure that we're adequately addressing marine debris in New Hampshire and all across the country?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I really think the way to address plastics and marine debris in our oceans is we really need to turn off the tap and slow the flow of single-use plastic production and use. From those coastal cleanups, as I mentioned before, the top 10 items found were food wrappers, so candy chip bags, cigarette butts, plastic beverage bottles, plastic bottle caps, straws and stirrers, plastic cups and plates, plastic grocery bags, plastic takeout containers, and other plastic bags and lids. So these are the types that are making the bulk of marine litter on beaches around the world. And so really, that's one of the keys to reduce the flow of plastics into our oceans, is to reduce the use of single-use plastic, reduce the production of that, and transfer and transition into more sustainable products that can both protect our oceans and reduce, so you don't need a beach cleanup on your beaches that's a crazy amount of litter in just a small New Hampshire sized coastline.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And thank you, Mr. Chair. And it's something we can work on with our partners globally, too. Thanks.
All right. I thank my colleague. And let me just tell our guests, we so appreciate your coming because, as we said something like 3 hours ago, this was a chance to really review where we are with respect to USMCA, 1 year old. And the reality, and I see this in my home state, because we are so trade sensitive. And the trade jobs often pay better than do the non-trade jobs. And the very first thing people say is, hey, I hear talk about new trade agreements. How about enforcing the laws that are on the books today? And that's what caused Senator Brown and I to write the rapid response provision. Mr. Davis, we thank you. We're going to be looking for, as I asked in my questions, your suggestions on how to take a strong provision and strengthen it, because the failure to enforce trade rules has real consequences. And in particular, the point that you made, Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath, is, when they basically said, let's go ahead with this new, agreement without really getting these new obligations in place, to use your words, had real consequences for innovators in terms of agriculture and healthcare, biotech, and technology. So I think the message that the three of you have given us, and of course, as Mr. Hatema knows, dairy is hugely important in my state, where we share many of the concerns that you've outlined today. It just redoubles our effort now with an administration that really wants to tackle these problems in an aggressive way to get at it. And you've given us a lot of good suggestions, and I particularly appreciate your outlining the real world consequences of the failure to have aggressive trade law enforcement. And coming from my state, which is of course nearly always thinking about trade as it relates to Asia, to have citizens in Oregon say, first thing that Washington's got to do is enforce the laws on the books, the trade laws on the books, sends a very powerful message, which you all have helped the word of the day to reinforce. So thank you all. We'll have for members their questions for the record due August 3rd. And with that, the Finance Committee is adjourned.